mean, it's a pleasant drive. I mean, people complain how long it takes to drive across Texas. I mean, I drive to Fort Bliss routinely. I'm actually on duty there tomorrow night. So you just get on the interstate, turn on the radio, set cruise control, and 8 hours later, you're having fun. So it's only 3 hours from San Antonio to here. All right, let me quickly check my zippers up, because I'll be embarrassing on YouTube. And so when I was asked to come here, Leisha was very open as to the subject that I could choose. So well, what do you want me to talk about? I said, whatever you want. And okay, I like that and I don't like that for two reasons. I don't like it because dang, I have to use my imagination to come up with something. But the good thing is that I don't have to talk about Shermans or tank destroyers. Actually, I'm going to put this on airplane mode. It affects the audio sometimes. Because frankly, I keep talking about Shermans and tank destroyers, and I would like to make a change. So after this talk was announced on the Facebook page there, I got reached out to by a professor over at A&M. Professor said, I got a request for you to talk about. Okay, I'm open to suggestions. And he says, this is right up your alley. He's right. It is right up my alley. And for all the jokes that we have about it, it is actually a fairly important thing to do for anybody who hasn't driven a tank in anything other than a straight line on good terrain. But I looked him up. It turned out that he was a professor of psychology. I told him that the Milgram experiments have already been done. We're not going to do that. And instead, who knows who this guy is? Right first name. It is a Leslie. There you go. McNair. What is he famous for? I'm sorry, what was that? Tank destroyers, ground forces, any others? It is unfortunate if one of your claims to fame is the way you died. Not looking for, but yes, yes to all three, and I will add one or two more. But normally, when he comes up in the context of tank museums or armor museums, it is in context of the tank destroyer branch and how he made a colossal error, supposedly, in creating tank destroyer branch. That's not quite why he's talking. Why I'm talking about him here, though. Because what I want to go over instead is how the US Army went from its 1939 configuration to a configuration which won World War II. And if there is probably any one person responsible for that feat, it is Leslie McNair. So this isn't exactly a talk about McNair, but most of everything that we talk about, or I will be talking about for the next 3 hours, is Leslie McNair's responsibility. So, when he gets brought in, the US Army was basically a frontier constabulary force. It was far more worried about Mexican banditos than it was about the Panzertruppen. And this partly was a result of the isolationism that the US was suffering from at the time. All the public cared that its military did really was protect the continental United States. Okay, maybe to a point its possessions. Or other places that the Marines were controlling at the time. So all the money went to the Navy and to the Air Force because they were the people protecting most of the United States. The Army, again, they were mainly focused on the Mexican border. There were a couple of units up north by the Canadian border, but realistically they weren't the primary problem. So, I mean, you can see from the M3, that is not a mid-1930s photograph. That is a photograph from 1941. 1941. The US Army was very much in love with its horses. People forget that. Now, at the start of 1940, the US Army was 8 infantry divisions, all of which were under strength. There was the 1 full cavalry division, plus other cavalry units at a smaller level, and other assorted odds and ends. I mean, the famous one is 7th Cavalry Brigade Mechanized, which is Adna Chaffee's crowd up in Fort Knox. but generally speaking, that was the only notable one. And there are 18 National Guard divisions, all of which were of somewhat questionable quality. So the problem that basically the powers that were wanted to solve was how to get the army to face off against that lot. Now, it didn't matter that the German army was actually as horse dependent, if not more so actually, than the US army. What mattered was what people thought the German military was capable of. And that was panzers and Stukas and God knows what else. That did end eventually. I mean, we can divert. If you really, really want me to, I can talk about tank destroyers and how they came with anti-aircraft guns and so on, but let's not worry about it. But so what's important is US Army has to deal with this lot. By the end of the war, the Army had fielded 89 infantry divisions, of which 87 saw combat. How well did they do? Only one, the 106, was effectively destroyed, or at least made non-effective. Considering where they were in 1939, that's not bad. So the problems that they had to solve are, as you can imagine. Now, the first problem is a very, very simple one. It is a problem of engineering and a problem of production. The US is very, very good at engineering and production, at least in the 1930s and 1940s. The Army had traditionally considered civilian industry to be a reserve component of the armed forces, especially after World War I. So they created the Army Industrial College. This is a kind of an equivalent of the Command and General Staff School. And at the time, its function was to train officers how to leverage civilian industry in order to meet the Army's needs in a future war. And as far as I know, and I'm open for correction, YouTube people, I'm sure you can put it up if I'm wrong, no other country had such an establishment. No other country cared that much about logistics. I mean, oh, Japan, oh, it's all glorious battle, and even the Germans, logistics? Where did you go wrong? Okay, who are these two? Nobody? I'm sorry? Dulles? No. On the left, William Knudsen, the only civilian ever to go from civilian to lieutenant general. Anybody know what he did? Yep. He was an industrialist. He came out of General Motors. Come 1941, FDR gives him a call that says, hey, I need somebody to really turn up the production taps to make us the arsenal of freedom, or the arsenal of democracy. Guy on the right, a little bit less well known. If you have health insurance, you might know him. Henry J. Kaiser. And he was an absolute master at getting the most out of his crews and building things. So he was responsible mainly, he did other things as well. He did anything from roads to, as I say, health insurance. But if he did one thing right, it was shipbuilding. So there are people that will go on at length about Knudsen and Kaiser and how great they were. And they were great, don't get me wrong, but the foundations for what they were able to build on were actually built by the US Army in the 1930s. So the Ordnance Department in the 30s had already realized that it needed to gear the nation for war, and more than 2 years before FDR calls Knudsen to the White House. So Ordnance Branch had already started doing surveys of industry to see what could US industry build. Ordnance Branch had split up the nation into ordnance districts. Each district was responsible for making the catalog of industry. And one of the things they did, for example, was they had all open houses. So they would rent out a convention center or a hall or whatever they had back in the 1930s, and they would put on display things that the Army might need made. And these could be anything from helmets to fuel pumps to backpacks to headlights. Anybody that made things in private industry could come up, look at everything that the Army might want built, and say, I can make that, I can make one of those, I can't make one of those. This is all cataloged by Ordnance Department and was available for use when the major production. The creation of all the production lines is another long topic I'm not going to go into, but the bottom line is that generally speaking, the Army made its contracts with the big corporations like GM, like Ford or whatever, and they did a lot of subcontracting out to other manufacturers, the cottage industries. But the catalog was there that these major companies could use them if they wanted to. The other thing that they did was they started making educational orders, educational contracts. So what an educational contract is, and it would never fly today, this is the Army buying things it doesn't need at prices higher than it needs to pay. So Springfield Armory, or whoever it is making the M1 rifle. Nice new rifle. But they only need, the Army is only 189,000 people. Compared to Portugal or Romania, the US Army is smaller. So depending on what source you use, it's 17th or 19th largest in the world. So you don't need millions and millions of rifles. You don't need to have the capacity for millions and millions of rifles. Well, what the Ordnance Department looks at is, if we expand the Army, they're going to want something to shoot with that's perhaps a little bit more capable in World War I surplus 1903s. So they go to, let's say, Winchester. They go to Remington. And they say, look, here is the M1 rifle. These are the designs, these are the specifications, this is how you build it. Make 30,000 of them. We don't need them, but make them. So they actually build them. They learn how to build them. They get all the bugs out of construction. And by the end of it, it was estimated, if you look up the Army Green Books for Ordnance Branch, and if you don't know what the Green Books are, they're available online or on the Center of Military History's website. And they are an absolutely encompassing view of what the Army got up to in World War II. And they estimate that these orders saved a full year off of the entry into production of the M1 rifle. And that's just a rifle. I mean, as I say, there were other educational contracts put out there. That's just an example of how they did it. So that was, as I say, the easy problem. The the US knew how to build stuff. Okay, you can guess what my next question is. Who's this bloke? George Marshall, yay! Photograph taken 1940. If you want to have an interesting eye-opener, look at a photograph of him in 1946. The war was not kind to that man. So he had to fix those problems. In amongst everything else that he had to deal with, he had to fix those problems. So to do it, he turned to Leslie McNair. And McNair was already known for being a very capable trainer. In World War I, he was Pershing's chief of training for artillery. But in the interwar period, his most recent posting in the late 30s was the commander of the Command and General Staff College in Fort Leavenworth. And he had been basically selected by Marshall to solve these problems because he had been identified as a man capable of molding the Army. At CGSC, he had a couple of functions. One was teaching the future leadership, which is still a function of CGSC. And the other was the doctrinal thought and development. So the brain trust in CGSC might come up with strange new ideas that they would bounce around with each other to see whether or not these things would be suitable for future warfare. This is sort of the academic or philosophical part of the war. And that's exactly what McNair started doing when he was at CGSC. And under his leadership, new doctrinal ideas were put forward, and one of them I'm going to come back to in a little bit later. And another thing he did, for example, was he modified the courses to make them better for the Army. One of the most important things he did was he shortened them. Why would you shorten a course to make the Army better? Any guesses? Say again?
More people through.
More people through. There's only 189,000 people in the Army. And how many of them are full-blood colonels?
It goes from a gentleman's course to an actually working course, and they learn efficiency and stuff.
How many divisions did I say were in the U.S. Army?
8 active,
And
89 National Guard.
18 National Guard.
I'm sorry.
Now, most of you have civilian jobs. Any guardsmen here or Army Reserve? Are you familiar with USARA? USARA, United Servicemen's Civil Relief Act, or something like that it is. Oh, Employment and Reemployment Rights Act. Basically, it says that if the Army drags you away for training or whatever, it cannot be held against you by your civilian employer. That did not exist in the 1930s. And if a course in Fort Leavenworth is 4 months long, and you raise your hand and you tell your employer, I'm going to Fort Leavenworth for 4 months to learn how to be a division chief of staff, your employer is not going to be happy with you. But if you raise your hand and say, I want to go for 1 month, the employer will probably let you go. And one of the things McNair realized was that 2/3 of the military were guardsmen. And he wanted to, he was willing to accept some loss in the regular Army capability in order to bring up the other 2/3 of the military that the US would rely upon in a major war. So eventually, again, Marshall picks him. He gets made the head of Army GHQ. A couple of reorganizations later, he is the head of Army Ground Forces. So equipment and logistics fell under service forces. Well, that was the, where do we get our stuff, which you mentioned earlier. But McNair was responsible for doctrine and training. So basically, buying the equipment is one thing. McNair's responsible for actually figuring out how to use it. I love this photo. What's going on?
Field demonstrations.
Say again?
Field demonstrations.
Field demonstrations. Whereabouts and when? Any ideas? I mean, if you don't get it right, so be it. It is the US. That's Plattsburgh, New York. 1939, August. Oh, if only they knew. The Plattsburgh maneuvers in 1939 were the largest that the US Army had done since World War I. 30,000 people, servicemen, were involved, including the 7th Cav Mechanized. And there were a couple of other things that were trialed, and probably the most important was the difference, a face-off between the square division and the triangular division. That was sorted out at Plattsburgh. As an aside, it's worth noting that the Germans and the Americans spent a lot of time talking in the interwar period, and even once the war had started, there was still a lot of communication between the US and German officers. They were neutral. Why not exchange information? I don't know why I'm bothering to point at that. All right, so here is what this change effectively was. So the interwar period, the one on the right is about 7,000 men smaller than the one on the left. Now, both of these divisions had exactly the same combat capability according to doctrine when at full strength. Any guesses why? How would you fight your division? How would you arrange your division? Two up, two in, and you have two in the front line, and then you have a reserve. Both divisions were given basically the same frontage area. Both were expected to have 2 brigades or regiments forward. That meant that the square division had 2 regiments in the rear, and the triangular division only had the 1 regiment in the rear. I say regiment, brigade, same. You get where I'm going. They're about the same size, give or take. So that meant that let's say this square division was running into serious trouble. You could withdraw 2 brigades off the line, replace them with 2 brigades, and have the same combat capability. You couldn't do that with the triangular division. But there were 2 additional points here. One is if you move to a triangular division for the same amount of men, more or less for every 4 square divisions, you can now get 5 triangular. Is it every No, sorry, no. Every 4 divisions you could get something like that. My mental. What's the alcohol level on this? Yeah, my brain does work better when suitably lubricated. Hang on, I think I have it written down here. Every 3 divisions you could get 4 triangulars. Okay, there we go. And the other thing is, if you are planning your entire army on the basis of losing 2 brigades or 2 regiments in your division in combat as a routine thing, you are probably doing something wrong. Or if you're expecting these level of losses, you are going to have other divisions in reserve, because obviously you know things are not going to go well. So what you can do also is with the triangular division is they're a lot easier to move around. The rear areas aren't as clogged. They take less logistics to move from A to B. So the army decides we are going to move to the triangular division. And so we go to the Louisiana and Texas maneuvers in 1940. If the Plattsburgh exercises were big at 30,000, we are now talking 100,000 people. The Army hasn't done this in a very, very long time. The Army has forgotten things like how to feed 100,000 people in the same place at the same time, or how many thousand horses that were there. And there were several thousand horses because the entire cavalry were out there. Now, there was, you will sometimes hear people say, yeah, the maneuvers were kind of taken half-heartedly. 61 fatalities from people that, oh, we got to get across that river somehow in order to beat the enemy, and people are drowning. There are aviators crashing in midair because they're dogfighting hard. I mean, if we had a training exercise today and 61 people were dead, there would be congressional investigations, generals would be fired. Utterly unacceptable. How did the Army do? It was awful. It sucked. There were a lot of problems with fieldcraft, but there was also a very important meeting, and present at the meeting were the Assistant Chief of Staff of the Army, a guy called Andrews, who was an aviator, his XO, Lieutenant Colonel Kemp, the 2 Armored Brigade commanders, who were Chaffee and Magruder, and a bloke named Patton. They met in the basement of a schoolhouse, and they had a thought as to what to do with the armored vehicles. The mechanized cav on the Chaffee and the infantry tanks on the Magruder. Specifically not invited to this meeting were the people who owned the cavalry and the infantry, because they were biased. End result, we're going to stand up an entirely new branch, legally for the purpose of service test, because only Congress can actually create a new branch. And that's why there are no armored force officers in World War II. An armored branch didn't really exist until after the war. And they called it armored force or an armored division, because if they called it a tank division, well, the infantry would say that's ours, it's a tank. And if they called it a cavalry division, well, the cavalry branch would say that's ours, it's cavalry. So they specifically chose the name armored division so that nobody who was then in charge of these things could get could interfere. So what they did was they made 2 divisions. Each brigade would be the core of a division. One division would stand up in Fort Knox, and the other division would stand up in Fort Benning. Any tankers? Anybody come? You went through Fort Knox?
Sure.
What do you think of the move to Benning? But don't forget, Benning was the home of tanks for many years before Fort Knox was. So it's not that bad. Anyway, so as I said, one of the biggest problem though that they had was that the Army's performance was atrocious. And this is what McNair was really, really good at, was training soldiers. So he implemented 2 major changes that we now take for granted as components of Army training. First, bottom up. You start at the fundamentals. The individual soldier. If you can't get the individual soldier to do his job, it doesn't matter if the company commander is fantastic. Start at the bottom, then you go to squad training, then you go to platoon training, and then company training, and work your way up. Now, that's not to say that the colonels are sitting around on their arses doing nothing, but they're not wasting the troops' time with that sort of thing at a time. So for the period between the 40 and the 41 maneuver seasons, and that's what, back then everybody worked in training seasons, so the exercises tended to happen in the summer, and in the winter was when you applied all the lessons that you learned the year before. The focus for the 1940 to 41 season was going to be low-level unit training. They wanted to get the platoons and companies to get the basics right before they started playing with battalions and corps and divisions. The other thing that he implemented was the Universal Training Curriculum. Basic combat training. Boot camp. Didn't exist. Back then, every branch was responsible for the training of its own soldiers. So if you signed your name and said, I want to be a cavalryman, off you go to Leavenworth and you will be trained by cavalry branch on whatever cavalry branch thought it was important for you to know. Same with signal branch, same with infantry or whatever. There was no common core. McNair said, nope, that's not going to happen anymore. You are going to have a common core training. There will be a basic training. He was fought tooth and nail by the branch commanders, but he eventually persevered and won. Now, there was a little bit of a downside to the centralized training, and that was it was felt that the junior leaders, like lieutenants, were not able to exercise their initiative as they used to. So a lieutenant used to get the new recruits and come up with a training plan and execute the training plan specifically for his new. That didn't happen anymore. Now he had this checklist of things that came down from GHQ that he had to train them in, and people complained that lieutenants were not getting any exercise in being individual, and that's actually fairly true even today. I mean, I remember one of my first times showing up to my platoon as a new lieutenant. It was a garrison environment at the time. We weren't out in the field, and I'm standing there like a fifth wheel on the car going, well, what the hell am I supposed to be doing? I went to the platoon sergeant afterwards. He said, hey, I feel like I'm a little bit, I should be doing something here. I said, well, sir, is everything that needs to get done getting done? Yeah. Then what's the problem? Fair point. And that's pretty much true. Admin stuff, the NCOs run it. But it did take me a little while to learn that as a new officer. All right, so something else that I had to do was when you were trained, you had to be certified. And certification came down again from GHQ. So today we call them T&EOs, Training and Evaluation Outlines. Previously they were known as RTEPs, if you're of that era, the late Cold War era. But it's a general idea. So there was this checklist that if a platoon in attack was going to be certified as capable of conducting a platoon in attack, they had to do this, they had to do this, they had to do this. That came down from above, and it was a universal standard as far as GHQ was concerned. Whether or not the evaluators on the ground were quite as standardized in the level is another matter. But it was a step in the right direction. And sometimes it was just simply ignored. So for example, tank destroyer battalions theoretically had to be certified in indirect fire as well as anti-tank duties before going overseas. There was at least one battalion, it was one of the African American battalions, or I guess back then they were called colored battalions, Negro battalion, whatever. They could not pass the indirect fire training, and they just stayed in the US trying to pass indirect fire. Eventually the Army said, okay, we'll pencil whip it. Off you go, just don't do any indirect fire missions. The other thing they had to do was they had to get the National Guard up to scratch. If the regular Army was bad, the National Guard was even worse. Because again, they didn't have training protections, and in terms of equipment and training dollars, they fell behind the regular Army. And the regular Army was short. So you can imagine how much was left for the National Guard. So what they decided to do was start mobilizing Guard divisions. Bring them up, put them onto federal orders for a year. A year was the theoretical maximum that they could be called up for at the time because it wasn't a war, and start training them. The problem was that there was a shortage, as I say, of people who knew what the heck they were doing to be the trainers, which is why they couldn't mobilize the entire National Guard at once. They mobilized a division, and they started staggering them so that the trainers had a little bit of time, the few trainers had a little bit of time to work. So they do that all winter, and they come to the 1941 maneuvers. The logisticians must have been pulling their hair out, trying to get the food and water and all that for the 400,000 men, the 17,000 horses, and goodness what else. Marshall had to go to Congress, had to say, why your entire budget for training for the entire army for the entire year is $140 million, and you want to spend $30 million on just this one exercise. Why? And Marshall's opinion was, well, we have this army. We need to find out, does it work? There are two ways of finding out. We do this exercise, or we throw it into combat. I think most of us would prefer that we found out in training. Then the reply from the congressman was, quote, "We'll give you whatever you need. We just trust you to take whatever efficiencies you can." Things are so different these days. So as far as the maneuvers went, there were no more any scripted scenarios. So it used to be, okay, here's a scenario. You are going to attack them. They're on the hill. Go kill them. What was going to happen for these maneuvers, though, was free play. You were given a mission. You knew you were going to be doing this for the next week or so. And when they said go, anything went, at least within the parameters of the exercise. So no going through California to get from Texas to Missouri or wherever. Another thing that they changed was administrative breaks. So what would often happen was you'd have your Company A attacks Platoon B on top of a hill, and they would then conduct an AAR. We do it today, but not in the middle of a war game today. Back then you would. So the company would charge up, they'd win, they'd lose, whatever, and then they'd get the leadership in, they'll get the lieutenants and the captains, maybe the sergeants, and they would have the AAR. What are all the other soldiers doing? They're catching sleep, they're getting food, they're watering their horses, they're doing all those administrative things that they need to do. But the only reason that they were able to do it is because the umpires said, stop the war, we're going to have a chat. So that got thrown away. If you wanted to fuel your tanks, to water your horses or sleep, the commanders now had to build that into their schedule and plan. Don't think about it, but it's a pretty dang important thing to do. Now, one of the problems with these massive war games is that now we're talking very much about the generals and the colonels. And one of the complaints, they called it the Louisiana Maneuver Complex, was that the individual soldiers and the platoons and the squads, they weren't exercised, they weren't practiced. And that was because of the way that war games worked in 1940, 1941. So I've got a whole other video on war game rules on my channel. If you've seen it, great. If you haven't, okay, go watch it. And one of the things, again, we take for granted today, we play laser tag. We know when we shot the opposition. Now, when I was growing up at 12 years old, it was, bang, I shot you when you were running from A to B behind that hill. Oh, no, I shot you over there before you even got to that place. The actual engagement process in World War II couldn't be done realistically. They didn't even try. It was done by rules. Now, the FM is available online. It is the 1942 FM, not the 1941 FM, but from what I can gather, it is very, very similar. And what would happen is every company had an umpire. And it was the job of the umpire to keep track of how many points of effectiveness the company had. And if the company took losses, he'd write off the points value. The troops were still there, so that they could still get some training value out of it, but the points value of the company was considered reduced as losses. So the units would meet, they would deploy, and then the umpires would walk out into the middle saying, "Stop the battle." One would keep an eye on the troops to make sure that they didn't feed or water the horses or do anything else like that they wouldn't really be doing. And the others, they would all meet in the middle and they'd compare notes and they'd say, "Right, I'm Company B, 37th Infantry. I have however many points. I have 150 points." And the other guy said, "Well, I'm on the blue side, and that's, I got 210 points." Do they have a 3-to-1 ratio advantage? No. Stay where you are, nobody's winning. And it was now responsibility of the higher commanders to maneuver the forces in such a way that somewhere you had a 3-to-1 advantage, and then you would win. The other guys would be told to retreat, and then you can move forward and keep going. There's a lot of starting and stopping. But it was the best way that they could figure out how to do it. Now, the other thing is we're talking about 400,000 men. That's a lot of umpires for a lot of companies. And that's not even one per company. You also have the terrain umpires, like this bridge is blown, you can't use it. There are umpires in the air looking down to see where there are flags. If you're an anti-aircraft unit firing at an aircraft unit, you had to lay out flags to show that you were shooting. So he had to look down, see the flag, look up, see what he was shooting at, and then make a judgment call how many airplanes got shot down. Or if there was a dogfight, then I'm sure he had a whale of a time. That part of the manual is not in 101-5. That's 105-5. It's a different manual. I haven't read it. Just in the AAR, again in the various Center for Military History website, they mention this problem. Okay, so the lower level, some of the individuals, they get good training. So for example, if you wanted to blow a bridge, the engineer umpire would sit there and watch as the engineering company took the fake explosives, went to the bridge and wired every piece that they had to wire it up, come back and hit the detonator. And the umpire would then check the circuits, and if all the circuits were good, fantastic, the bridge is blown. Put a sign on the bridge saying bridge out of service. If you wanted to lay a minefield, you had dummy mines, and you had to lay each individual mine. You couldn't just hand wave and say, "Okay, we spent an hour, we've laid the minefield." Nope, you got to actually do it. So those technical skills were trained, but this platoon attacks that squad wasn't done. It was all done by the points. The anti-tank rule, which has gotten a lot of attention in the literature, and it is considered partially responsible for the mistake that is the tank destroyer branch. Very well timed, that one. So according to the anti-tank rule, the only way, as far as common perception goes, the only way for a tank to destroy an anti-tank gun was to run over it. And now, if you're curious, that is the Bataan Memorial in Camp San Luis Obispo. The 194th Tank Battalion, one of their tanks ran into a Japanese anti-tank ambush, and they ran over the anti-tank gun, just like the training said. And it worked. Anti-tank gun. There's also a very famous painting of which that diorama is based. So, according to the general consensus, this silly and unrealistic rule gave an unhealthy advantage or an unfair or unrealistic advantage to the anti-tank forces, thus giving the people in charge of coming up with the tank destroyer doctrine this idea that they were right. And as a result, the anti-tank doctrine, the tank destroyer forces, were on the basis of false information or false data to begin with. There are two problems with this line of thinking. Yeah, we don't think it's true. If you go to page 16 of the manual, and that's again, I'm giving you the pages so you can, when you go on the internet later and you start talking about this, you can cite chapter and verse. It's one of the things they teach you in OCS is show me the regulation. Because there are so many things we take for granted that are actually kind of shouldn't be. So page 16 gives a list of ways an anti-tank gun can be destroyed, and sure enough, it says anti-tank guns can be destroyed by tanks or other vehicles by running over them if the anti-tank gun hasn't shot them first. But there's an exception, and it's on pages 17 and 18. It discusses fire duels between a tank and an anti-tank gun. How do you adjudicate stationary tanks? It had to be a stationary tank, which is fair enough because you didn't have stabilizers back then. But you had a stationary tank, you had the anti-tank gun. How do you adjudicate the duel between them? Or worse, what if you have an entire tank company or tank battalion going up against another anti-tank company or battalion? How do you deal with those rules? So there's 2 pages in the manual on just how you deal with that. So yes, it was possible for a tank to shoot the enemy anti-tank gun instead of just running it over. Now, I am going to state one caveat with that statement, is that this is, again, the 1942 manual. I have not seen the 1941 manual. I cannot hand on heart say this rule is in the 1941 manual as well. But given how close the two things were, I'm pretty sure it was. And it won't make a difference anyway, and I'll explain why in a second. Under alternatives, even if that rule didn't exist, is the way that the tank interaction worked was if you had a tank, all infantry within 100 meters of it, all enemy infantry was neutralized. It was, your firepower score was 0. There were certainly rules that said that infantry could shoot at artillery, including anti-tank guns. So if you happen to have infantry with your tank has now neutralized the enemy infantry, your infantry is dealing with the anti-tank gun. Or there's also rules that if you had observed fires, if you had a mortar one terrain feature behind, you could call in the mortar would suppress the anti-tank gun for you to then deal with it. So that's why I say the rule works to encourage correct behavior, because you want to have a combined arms unit. And in the 1940 and the Louisiana 41 maneuvers, the US Army did not operate in combined arms units. If you had the armored division, one of the 2 divisions, and you had a task, you would assign the armored brigade, or one of the 2 armored brigades, or you would assign the infantry brigade. You wouldn't do any cross-attaching. And what this rule would do is punish you for not doing it. Now, by the North Carolina maneuvers in 1941, the armored force had figured this out. And in the 41 maneuvers, they did start cross-attaching. And that's what eventually became the combat command system that was used during World War II. So there is a general rule in war games, video games or pen and paper games. It doesn't matter what the mechanics are. If the outcomes are reasonable for the decisions that are made, it's a good war game. So that's what I say. If the rules for this penalize you for not using combined arms, it doesn't matter the mechanic of the rule, it's a good rule. So afterwards, you have the assessment. Just how good is the Army now? McNair said, if we had to fight now, we could fight effectively, but we would still take way too many losses. We need to keep working. Now, McNair had his black book of commanders. He was rather famous for this one. He had, like, every senior officer, division commander, maybe chief of staff, and about 2 or 3 lines about each paragraph, about each person, with a recommendation of basically keep or get rid of. And officially, the person in charge of selecting division commanders was Marshall. He would select it, the name would be confirmed by the War Department, and then the notification would be made, hey, congratulations, you now have a division. In actuality, Marshall listened a lot to McNair, and so whatever was in McNair's black book ended up basically going to Marshall, and the recommendations and the firings and the bloodlettings went accordingly. Now, there was some resentment because most of the people that McNair fired were guardsmen, National Guard officers. He replaced them with regular Army officers. And you can imagine that didn't go well for both the Guard units and even the politicians, like the governor of the state of, let's say, Alabama. When the Alabama Division Guards commander is removed, the governor and the senators are not happy. And the troops aren't happy because they're getting the guy that they know and maybe like replaced by some outsider from the regular army who doesn't know how things really work in this unit. Whether it works correctly or not, that's the way it works. Now, in fairness, McNair did also fire a bunch of active duty commanders as well. That doesn't get very much attention. And also, in fairness, a lot of the National Guard commanders were just plain old and lacked vigor. I think you saw on one of the earlier slides that a full quarter of first lieutenants were over the age of 40. Yeah. Although in fairness, in the regular army, the average major was 48. So he had to sort out the leadership problem. Horse cavalry. The horse cavalry in the 1941 maneuvers performed very well. And the reason is that the 1st Cavalry Division commander and the chief of branch of cavalry took a very long, hard look. I mean, they're getting all this pressure from elsewhere saying, you need to mechanize. The horse no longer has a place on the battlefield. So in the 1940 to 41 period, they took a very long, hard look. How do we make our cavalry viable on the modern battlefield? And they made their changes, they made their applications. They were very willing to take vehicles like the Bantam that showed up that could tow a 37mm gun to deal with the enemy armor. They weren't so hidebound that it had to be horse or nothing. They mechanized the horses. They had horse trailers to move entire horse units around hundreds of miles. And then when they got to the river, they'll just swim the horse across the river. So they did do very well. They show up in the enemy rear. They cause all sorts of havoc. By the end of one of the war games, Patton's rear was basically overrun by horse cavalry. However, in the after-action assessments from War Department, they said, yeah, horse cav, you guys did well, but you also didn't really do anything that the mech guys couldn't do. A couple of things here or there, but no, we're going to go all mech for the cavalry. Now, that said, in the middle of 1943, I think it was early 43, there was a request put out for about 4,500 horses and cavalrymen to be prepared to ship to Europe. And given what was going on at the time, I have to assume it was for the Italian campaign. No specifics are given, I'm afraid. And then there were the tank destroyers. So that was that little thing I mentioned earlier that came from CGSC, back when McNair was in charge of CGSC. And in 1939, a manual was published called Anti-Mechanized Defense Tentative. And this was basically McNair telling the brain trust in CGSC, come up with a solution to this tank problem. Because Lord knows what we've been doing up till now. The French have tried it, the British have tried it, everybody's tried it and it ain't working. So the solution was to have entire mass concentrations of anti-tank guns. Again, I have other videos on this. Feel free to check them out. But that solution was applied in the 41 maneuvers, and it worked. Because of the rules, or whatever, it worked. The bottom line is that in those maneuvers, an armored division was met by multiple brigades of anti-tank units that were rushed to, 2nd Armored's coming this way. Actually, it was Patton. Let's set up 3 brigades of anti-tank guns. Let's see how they do. Now, the war was called Index. Yeah, they stopped the war before that battle actually happened. But you can draw your own conclusions, regardless of what the rules were in real life. If you had an anti-tank, basically an armored division meets an anti-tank division, it's not going to go well for the armored division. So they took that. They said, okay, yeah, we need to make an anti-tank profession or center of excellence, we'll call it today. Who wants it? Infantry says no. Artillery go, well, no, you want to shoot at tanks directly? No, we don't do that. Okay, it's not going to be artillery. Armored force, you want it? Oh, hell no. Okay, well, Bruce, well, hey, you're the new chap in charge of this new thing we're standing up called Tank Destroyer Force. So we move on. The Victory Program, developed in 1941. How is the US military going to win the future war? And they made a couple of assumptions. This is like mid-1941, so the attack on the Soviet Union had just started. It was a major by the name of Rademeyer. And he calculated that if it was just the US and the UK and the Commonwealth, for what good Canada and Australia could provide, who are fairly sparsely populated, what do we need to beat the Germans? And he says we need 215, is it? 215 divisions. Now, I said earlier, the US Army actually fielded 89. So there was an attack of reality, and they decided this was not going to happen for several reasons. One, hey, the Soviet Union wasn't knocked out of the fight after all. Okay, that's good. That's a lot of Germans we don't have to kill. And the next one was, well, even if we did have 215 divisions, what would we do with them? Because we don't have enough shipping to send them anywhere. They'll just be sitting around on their arses, okay, maybe doing a bit of training, but not being productive. And also, by the way, this is going to murder our civilian economy or the war production. Who's going to be making the tanks anymore? So what they started doing was they started again, like they staggered the National Guard Division training. They also staggered the creation of the divisions that would fight the Army of the United States. And it was done, one of the advantages was going to be that you could take lessons learned on the other divisions that had already gone forward. So by the time, let's say, 1st Division is fighting North Africa, they're sending messages back to the US going, hey, this is the sort of thing you need to do to change the basic training in the US before you ship guys over here. And that was done soon enough they had time to implement it on a lot of the later units. So for example, one of the things that was sent out was, our guys are green, they've barely heard the sound of a rifle, and all of a sudden they're coming under major, machine guns and artillery and all that. They're shocked. So one of the things McNair implements, which again we have today, is battlefield inoculation, or the infiltration course. Now, if you went to basic, you did it. I did it. You fire machine guns over your head. They got explosive pits going off. It's unite. It was actually kind of fun. I don't know about you. I enjoyed it because you knew it was perfectly safe. So within McNair's term of doing this, he started it in early 43, and by the time he had died, the US Army had expended 250,000 tons of explosives just doing this. You can imagine what the Germans might have preferred to do with 250,000 tons of explosives that it didn't have. But again, we have that now. Now, the way that you made a new division also, and they could do this because of the way it was staggered, was you formed a cadre or a corps for this new division out of a division that already existed. And this had its good points and its bad points. Now, in theory, what you were supposed to do was pick you're going to send 1,200 men out of your 19,000 man division or 70,000 man division to go be the core of this new division. You are supposed to pick your best and brightest. And the reason you would do it, obviously, is that the new division needed help because you only have 1,200 men that know what they're doing. The good news is your people that you're sending over, they're getting promotions. You're taking a company commander, you're sending him over to this new division, he's going to be a battalion XO or maybe a battalion commander. The bad news is you've just lost all of your best and brightest. So you're promoting your new guys, you get a couple of replacements in, and you're trying to sort yourself out. Now, there is a book by Pete Mansour called The GI Offensive in Europe. And I don't know how he had time to write this because at the time he was working as the G3 in Europe. But he has a chart in this book that shows where every cadre came from every division. So the example was June 1942, 1st Division. They're about to go partake in the assault on North Africa. They get rated for 1,200 officers and NCOs who become the core of the 76th Division. In November of 42, they want to stand up 100th Division. They go to the 76th and they say, give me 1,200 of your best and brightest. So some of them are originally from 1st Division and kicked over to 100th. Some were the guys that just got trained up and sent overseas. Correction, sent from one to the other. So that was fair enough. I mean, they kind of accounted for this in the training and the schedule, but what it didn't account for was battle casualties. So as I say, if there's two things McNair is lambasted for, the tank destroyer doctrine and the individual replacement system. The tank destroyer thing, I think, he's unfairly lambasted, and the individual replacement system thing is a little bit more nuanced. So as we know, that the standard for comparison is the Germans. The Germans would send a unit forward, they'd fight until they were bled dry, then they'll be pulled out of the front, sent to the rear for X many months or whatever. New recruits would come in, they'd be trained up, and then this fresh, restored division would go back into the line. The US didn't do that. If you suffered casualties, you put in a request and a new bloke would show up. And oftentimes, the reputation got to the point that you wouldn't even bother learning the guy's name because he might be dead by the morning. Because nobody cared about him, he probably didn't know what he was doing, and yeah, it didn't necessarily go well. Now, the problems were twofold. Now, first, the idea of shipping units to and from the homeland for reconstitution. Yeah, that could work for Germany, where you get on a train and you home in 8 hours. Doesn't work so well for the US. So if you ship somebody or something over to the Europe or Pacific, you are pretty much there for the duration. And the other thing was that you had shipping problems, because if you want to ship an entire unit to and fro, not only does it take forever, you don't have the space on ships to do it. So the decision was made, we're going to send individuals over. They're going to go to the replacement depot, the notorious rebel depots, and then they'll be dispatched to wherever. Now, the theory, which didn't necessarily match the practice, as we all know, the theory was that these divisions that needed replacements would be brought off the line and reconstituted in France, similar to the way that the Germans would do it in Germany. The reality was that the Corps and Army commanders usually didn't have the ability to pull divisions out of the line for this. The best they could do was send them to quiet areas like the Ardennes and integrate there. The division commanders sometimes came up with their own policies, like, okay, new guys, welcome. We're not going to send you to the foxholes quite yet. We're going to keep you in the back. We're going to give you a little bit of training ourselves first before sending you forward. Now, there were other changes made. The rebel depots became also a part for refresher training or whatever else. But this was a McNair thing, and he, for good or ill, it was his baby and his bag to hold. Now, that said, it is kind of difficult to see what else or how else that problem could have been solved. But the other problem that they had there was, where are you going to get these men? And oftentimes they needed them faster than the basic training pipeline was producing them. So they would raid other units that had not yet shipped. So again, the triangular division, about 17,000 men, give or take. One of the triangular divisions was the 106th, the Golden Lions. Who knows what happened to them? Yep, Saint-Vith, really, more than Bastogne, but yeah. 2 regiments were simply encircled and wiped out. You can go into the details. I think they put up a much better fight than they're given credit for. But they stood up in October 43 with whatever cadre they got the cadre from. Before they had shipped a year later, they were rated for 1,200 officers and 12,400 men to replace people who were lost in other divisions. So, I mean, this isn't just 1,200 people for a cadre. You can afford to lose 1,200 people for a cadre and train up your replacements. This was, you just lost your entire division halfway through your mobilization cycle. Here, have another batch, start over. Oh, yeah, by the way, your schedule for going to Europe hasn't changed. They show up, 7 days after they show up, Battle of the Bulge starts. As I say, they actually did fight very well, but they were not exactly set up for success. Who's heard that? German infantry were better than, German infantry were more effective than American. I've heard them, it's out there. So there was a study, and it was statistically shown by the study that on a man-for-man basis, a German infantryman was indeed better than a US infantryman. Okay, I can accept that. And the reason is the AGCT, the Army General Categorization Test. Those of us that went in, we took the ASVAB. Same general thing. New guy shows up, they give you a standardized test, says, well, what are you good at? Are you smart? Do you barely know how to pick up, which end of a rifle the bullet comes out of? And the US used this system, I think, differently to most other countries. Now, infantry combat requires fast thinking and intelligent people. The idea of dumb grunt going up with a rifle is not going to be as effective as he needs to be on the battlefield. The problem is everything else that's going on. So I put down who cares, because it didn't matter. The Germans could get the most intelligent people and put it into the line infantry and have good infantry. The people who got first crack at the smartest of the American intake were the Army Air Forces. Oh, you're really smart. Oh, you're going to be a pilot. Then the Army Service Forces took their cut. Oh, you're mechanically inclined. Fantastic. You're going to join Ordnance Corps and be a mechanic. Oh, you know, you have an idea what a volt is or what an ohm is. Join the Signal Corps. Your okay. So what would happen in the end is a rifleman would come up against this superior German infantry over yonder from the Signal Corps with the intelligent people that know electronics. Yeah, I need you to remove my problem at grid 1, 2, 3. Thank you. And the Signal Corps guy would be, courtesy him, the message would get to the mathematical genii that were taken by the artillery branch. The artillery branch would do the mathematics, using a computer sometimes by the end of the war, I think. Okay, I'm not sure quite when ENIAC entered service. But they had all the tables and they could do the mathematical assessments. And then they would fire lots and lots of artillery, which the ammunition for which was transported on trucks that were maintained by the people who knew and understood mechanics, because they were mechanically inclined. And I don't care how good or how fantastic you are as an infantryman, you are not invulnerable to a 105mm fragmentation round. It didn't matter. And it's one of the things I always go, you always have to look at a military component holistically. How does it fit into the larger scheme of things? You can't just say, this tank is better than that tank, this infantryman is better than that infantryman. That's not how an army works. So, I have a note here, never lose sight of the forest for the trees. Excuse me. Okay, now shipping is not McNair's department. That was the Transportation Corps, that was the US Navy. But, as I mentioned a little earlier, he is subject to the rules. He cannot magically transport everything from A to B where it needs to be, hence the staggered creation of the divisions. So he created a couple of other policies which are subject to a little bit of debate. Battle need and battle worthiness. Battle worthiness is a little bit less controversial. Basically, it said that if we're sending it overseas for the troops to use, it will bloody well work. And so that the troops have confidence in their equipment. I mean, it may not be the most lethal thing out there, but he knows exactly what it will do and it can be relied upon to do it. And as long as it keeps working, it means that there's no point in shipping a piece of equipment all the way over just for it to break down as soon as it gets off the boat and sit there in France, awaiting parts that also have to take up shipping space from A to B. So battleworthiness. He refused to allow, AGF's position was we refused to allow a combat zone to become a testing agency. And the other one was battle need. The engineers and the scientists, they were always coming up with great new ideas. This piece of, this tank destroyer, the T-14, is 5% better than the M6. We should change to the T-14. No, it's not good enough to warrant the change in the logistics and the training, unless it is sufficiently good enough that the commanders at the other end are asking for this thing. We are not going to ship it over. And that's where you get people start to complain about the 76 or the 75 millimeter gun not being overseas in sufficient numbers. Now, again, you may have seen it, I have long rants on this issue, but that was a McNair policy, that if it wasn't asked for, we ain't gonna send it. We don't care what the engineer, no General Barnes, it's that, yes, I realize that your T-23 tank will go as fast backwards as forwards, and it can spin on the spot. We don't want it. Any IV division, guys? No? The US Army has only ever had one motorized division, and that was 4th. The theory behind it was that there were going to be 5, one for each armored corps. Each armored corps would be 2 armored divisions and 1 motorized division in order to keep up. The problem was shipping. An infantry division, to ship a division overseas, had about 2,000 vehicles and required 32,000 tons of shipping. An armored division required about 60,000 tons of shipping. A motorized division required about 60,000 tons of shipping for its 3,000 vehicles. You are the theater commander at the other end. You're given your menu of things that you can request. You can request 1 armored division, 2 infantry divisions, or 1 motorized division. Which one are you not going to request? So 4th Division sits in the US for years as a motorized division and doesn't go anywhere until 1943, when finally the Army says, this is stupid. They're sitting on the arses doing nothing. We're going to convert them back to a regular division. We'll send them to France, and then they happen to take the worst casualty rates of any division of the Army. I really am annoyed. I never scanned or photographed the page, but it was like 4th Division had 700% casualties, and if you looked at the by branch, the rifleman was like 11 casualties for every rifleman. It was absolutely insane. So motorized division existed, didn't go anywhere, and off they went. Okay, we all know what happened to McNair in the end. And he has been undergoing a little bit of a historical revision of late. So it's a bit like the Sherman. He went from, oh, he was bad because he came up with individual replacement and tank destroyer, to now, well, okay, he's a little bit better than we thought. So, I mean, if you think about it, what he achieved, the man was basically a genius. I realize that the great man theory of history is hotly debated, or the great person history. I think it gets rid of one of the objections. But I think McNair is one of those people that gives credence to the fact that, yes, there is some merit to the great man theory. Yes, every Army officer is expendable and can be replaced. But either way, he was good. So I am going to call it quits at that. I'll be going a good hour. Fantastic. I was worried it was only going to be 20 minutes. What are your questions? They don't have to be on this subject.
It's great that we put the Army together, but it seems like in North Africa and in New Guinea, when our forces went into actual combat, there were a lot of deficiencies. It just seemed like the enemy and the terrain, they couldn't.
Well, they were, because they hadn't seen combat. What happened after Germany invaded Poland? What did the German army do afterwards?
They reorganized.
They reorganized. They realized that they needed to have some serious retraining of especially battalion commanders, and that was something that you could only learn in combat. And the US, as good as McNair was, you can't get away from that. The real world will teach you things that you needed to know. It's my flight instructor tells me experience is a terrible teacher. It teaches you the lesson you need after you needed it. And that applies here. Now, that said, the US still did creditably. I mean, who won Kasserine Pass? Did they?
No, the Germans didn't get their.
The Germans were defeated. Now, the Americans took a licking that ideally they, a more experienced and better trained and better configured U.S. Army would not have done. But they still did well enough. What else?
Talking about the communication back between the combat units back in the U.S., have you covered that already, or can you talk about it a little bit?
I have a couple of videos up. One is the reading from the Book of Armaments, is the name of the book, and it's basically all the assessments that are coming back from North Africa. I have talked about them otherwise. So there were several. I tended to focus more in my research on the technical things, information coming back from the field saying, yeah, we need forget the M10, the 3-inch tank destroyer. We want the 90 millimeters. This came from 5th Army in March 44. And we want an entire division of 76 millimeter Shermans. We don't want any 75s.
What was the turnaround time on that sort of communication? That may be more.
They went by telegram. They usually went by telegram. So what would happen is it was done by survey, mainly by survey. So that thing about we want only 76s and 90s, that was actually a telegram that got sent from 5th Army straight. I have that somewhere in an archive. But more frequently what would happen is Ordnance Branch, let's say, would dispatch an officer to the ETO or to NATO and say, here is a 5-page questionnaire of things. And it could vary from what is your opinion on towed anti-tank guns versus self-propelled anti-tank guns, through to how have you integrated your indirect fire from tank destroyers to the fire direction center of artillery. And these lessons learned, basically like CALL today, the Center for Army Lessons Learned, were then coming back, as near as I could tell from the dates, it would be about a month to 2 months between going over and then getting the information back. Now, how long it took to actually do anything with that information, I'm a little less certain about. I do have another video, is a tank for 1945, and it goes over the meetings that happened about the feedback from the tanks from 1942 in 1943 as to what they were going to do for 1945. So that's the sort of the lead time that they were talking about for really big decisions.
Was artillery the best?
Was U.S. artillery the best?
Cool.
Anytime the U.S. won a desperate victory, the artillery was probably the crowd that broke it. So again, we mentioned Kasserine. What really stopped the German push north into the British was the arrival of was it 9th Division or 9 Corps Artillery, and they just showed up with battalions of 155 and 105, and they just plastered the Germans, who eventually turned around and went back. Battle of the Bulge, you had the 3 prongs. You had the Saint-Vith prong, so that was 106 and then 7th Armored and one of the other was the 3rd Armored, and then you had the northern prong, and that was stopped by the greatest artillery concentration the U.S. Army has ever fielded, to the point that one village is getting 200 rounds a minute. So the U.S. could call artillery quickly. Anybody from a low level. It was relatively rapid because of all the mathematical tables that were available. And it was also run by officers and NCOs who knew how to read them and apply them. The guns were perfectly serviceable. Oh, and by the way, they invent the VT fuse, which it's too secret to use, but in the Battle of the Bulge, just say, okay, yeah, now it's time to use it. So, yes, if American artillery wasn't the best in the world, it was fighting very, very hard for that. The British will say that the British artillery was very good. Yes and no.
You described the system of umpires and the 40 and 41 maneuvers and everything. If every umpire is out there basically keeping all these scores, I'm just assuming that would generate just some massive amount of paperwork. How does someone higher up, or how did the Army handle taking all that information, aggregating it to something useful at a higher level, or far up the chain of command, basically?
I don't think it was necessary to do that, because all that the colonels and generals cared about was, are we winning? Is this unit defeating that unit? The level of, we defeated them by a 4-to-1 ratio versus a 3-to-1 ratio, and that could be flexed. The umpires were given a little bit of discretion. I mean, if this unit was entrenched on top of a hill, the attackers needed more than a 3-to-1 ratio, sort of thing. So once the umpires made their decision, the actual score probably didn't matter. All that mattered was Company A meets Company B, Company A wins and moves forward. And if records were kept, I can't imagine that they would have been. Because the other thing that always gets me when I go in the archives and looking in the archives, and I have to remember that somebody sat down with a mechanical typewriter. He thought it was important enough to go clack, 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 use paper, use ink. Today we record everything just as a matter of course because it's free. I mean, hard drive space is cheap. Telephone calls. General Barnes calls General Devers. He says, I got this great new gun for you. It's called a 76. It mounts on Shermans. There was a stenographer listening on the line, writing word for word what this telephone conversation was going on. That's the sort of thing that the Army thinks is important enough to keep. Whether, the score of this company, the Battle of the PD River, I really don't think it went anywhere.
Who were the judges on this?
Say again?
Who were the judges?
They were usually taken, so they were taken from the Louisiana maneuvers. I believe the judges were generally taken from the Northeast.
They officers or senior enlisted? Or?
They would usually be officers, I think. But again, we're talking so many companies, they would have had to have NCOs somewhere. I think the FM actually gives criteria, but I would be lying if I said I remembered.
This is more of a question about like modern vehicles, but it seems like the Army is putting a lot of research money into autonomous systems. And do you think there is a role on the battlefield for these autonomous or semi-autonomous armored vehicles?
There is. I just don't think that the role exists for them on their own right now. Because one is going to get stuck and somebody's going to have to go out with a tow rope and pick the damn thing up and hook it up and they pull it out. Depth perception, I mean, we have enough difficulty getting cars to not run over bicycles or to run into police cars on a marked highway. So we are a long way from getting to pure autonomy on a modern armored vehicle. So radio controlled, yeah, there will be some of that, but even then, if you're there, you don't have the same depth perception out of it. This is a technological problem. We will solve it eventually. I will probably be retired by then.
A follow-up on modern, what about the new proposed M1 tank of putting the autoloader in and sticking the 3 crew members?
I'm fine with the autoloader. Sticking 3 guys in the... Again, I think that's one of those technical problems that we're not quite there yet, which may be why nobody's really doing it, except as demonstrators. I personally like the ability to stick my head up and look out over the edge and see if I'm about to run over something I shouldn't be about to run over. But if you look at the latest cars with the top-down view of you parking and you're looking around, well, that's not really a problem anymore. Peripheral vision, I mean, I get much wider peripheral vision sticking my head out of the hatch than my gunner does through his periscope. Again, we got modern VR 360-degree awareness all integrated on your camera. They call it iron vision, where you're looking through transparent armor. We're definitely moving in that direction. The autoloader is necessary for several reasons. It makes the tank smaller, it makes the tank lighter. As ammunition gets bigger, I mean, a 120 is heavy enough. A 130, good luck to you lifting that thing into the breach. Do you keep the crew separate from the turret? That is... There are arguments for and against right now. I think against is winning. I may not say that in 10 years.
when they were setting up you said they stood up 89 divisions. They have a schedule of what kind of division, armored infantry, artillery, or whatever, or was it due to battlefield need?
It was scheduled, but I don't know where the schedule could be found. So as I said, Mansour's book only covers the infantry divisions. It doesn't cover the others. I would, excuse me. I don't have a solid answer as to where the answer can be found. Sorry.
You spoke earlier about the bias to the anti-tank guns and the war games. And I'm curious, how effective were the U.S. Army anti-tank guns? And how effective were they, or were they any more effective than the German anti-tank gunners?
I can't make a statement that, your typical anti-tank crew for the U.S. Army was better than your typical anti-tank crew for the German Army. I don't know if anybody can make that statement, if anybody has made such an assessment. So the anti-tank guns that were used in these maneuvers, they came in several types. In the 1941 maneuvers, there was a battalion of T-12s. That became the M3 gun motor carriage downstairs. That was the first time that they were used. They actually were used very aggressively. They overran some division command post, as I recall, during one of the exercises, because they were self-propelled. There were a portee type system, a portee, where they basically took the 37mm anti-tank gun, they bolted it to the back of a truck in a similar manner to the M6 gun motor carriage. But it literally was just a case of let's just bolt it on and drive it around. And there were the towed anti-tank guns, which particularly the cavalry liked. The problem is you were talking about 37mm guns in 1941. I think that was the big problem that the US Army had. Then by the time they got fielded, well, what is the standard anti-tank gun of the US Army? It's a 6-pounder. The 3-inch gun, that was a tank destroyer. And you have that problem that a gun will eventually get so big it's useless as an anti-tank gun, because you shoot, you either kill everybody or you die. There's no middle option here. If you've seen an 88 or if you've seen a towed 3-inch, it's not the sort of thing you can pick up and drag. Whereas the 6-pounder was small enough that an infantryman could pick it up and have a decent chance of running away. In the Anzio campaign, there was a comparison. There were two side-by-side units. One was in M10s and one had towed 17-pounders. Every single one of the 17-pounders was lost, and only 2 of the 40 or whatever M10s were lost because they could get away. And you also saw at Mortain, where the German had a counterattack on the west coast of France. One of the units that stopped them was a towed tank destroyer battalion. They stopped the Germans, but almost every single gun was lost because he couldn't move. And the Germans did the same. You look at the size of an 8.8. The 88, the best anti-tank gun in the world. Well, yeah, if you can get a shot off without even being spotted. The Pak 40, that was a good anti-tank gun, but also pretty useful was the 5cm that they had. Doesn't get a lot of attention. Looks like a small little Pak 40. That's small enough that you can actually survive. Either that or you fire a couple of rounds, leave the gun behind and leg it. Which you might be able to do if you're the US with the manufacturing capability, but if you're the Germans and you don't have the manufacturing capability, that's another matter. Now, I haven't answered your question, but I thought it was an interesting digression. Anybody else?
Going back to drones.
Mm-hmm.
You would end up with a combination then of some vehicles having people in them, still some infantry, since that's a unit that can do every mission in the Army. And then you've got drones, which implies artificial intelligence. And you talked about it's always still right now needing people to go out to at least maintain them. But you will have drones engaging people. Is there any thoughts on morals and ethics of warfare on that? If they're not being remote controlled, they're killing people on their own.
My personal thoughts?
Yes.
Is it legal?
I have no idea on that. Although
realistic.
They talk about using a remote drone in law enforcement situations, and I don't necessarily like that.
Well, that hit the news because San Francisco just approved it. But it was first done by Dallas PD about 5 years ago. I didn't even think about it. What were the options? They couldn't exactly bring an armored car up. They had to manhandle the robot himself. Robotics is robotics. If you use a guided missile, it's a robot coming in and homing in on you, even if it was a human to pull the trigger. The bottom line, I guess, is for the purposes of legality, are you killing legitimate targets? If you're killing legitimate targets, it doesn't matter how it's being done. War is inherently an unpleasant thing that we try to avoid. And trying to get, I'm sure the philosophers will have a whale of a time, but for me, the ethics in war is something is a war crime, something is not a war crime.
Sometimes the definition of that changes. You talk about rules of engagement in World War II, how we prosecuted things in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Agreed, but we don't apply things retroactively with most cases. The crime against humanity thing, that was retroactive, and that caused its own series of legal questions. But I, as a colonel or whatever, that's not my problem. Or the person who programmed the robot to go off and find something to kill. I think we're in the happy position that AI is not good enough to make such distinctions and will not be for many, many decades. Should we?
So, and the difference between a drone being controlled by someone versus something that's completely autonomous, the real step over the line is when it becomes autonomous, you begin to worry about the fact, can it tell the difference between me and the other guy?
Well, that's one of the questions. So as they're reducing crew sizes in tanks, one of the problems that they're dealing with is sensor overload. You've now gone from 4 to 3, and they're talking about the U.S. Army believes we can go to 2-man tanks. When obviously we're not there yet, but you can go to. That's a lot of information and decision making that these 2 men have to do, and there is quite an industry in artificial intelligence to take that workload off of the soldier and put it into the computer for the computer to figure out. So what they're looking to do is, okay, you got target acquisition. That's easy for AI to figure out. There's a hot spot over there. Hey, you might want to look at that. But they're also looking at using AI to aid in target identification. Now, for now, it's still the man inside the tank has got to hit yes, no, kill. But he's doing so with the assistance of the AI. If the AI gets it wrong, he makes a recommendation to the soldier, and the soldier says yes, kill, and it's a mistake. Who's at fault? Well, he's responsible. You're not going to court-martial the AI.
Well, that's the point.
You're getting into a whole realm of ethics I probably shouldn't be talking about anyway, especially not since I haven't retired yet.
I have one guy, the Marines, they were talking about their decision to get rid of the tanks, and one of the things they were saying, well, look at all the lessons that are being learned from the Ukrainian war that look like tanks or just dinosaurs.
No, the decision by the Marines has nothing to do with Ukraine. It was done long ahead of that.
They're justifying it, saying, look, we were right in making a decision.
Who's they?
The Marine command they were talking about.
I don't think Commandant Berger has made any statement of that nature.
Well, it was one of his other ones in a congressional hearing. He was talking about, because they were hammering him about the tanks. He said, don't you really want to bring tanks back into the Marine Corps force? He goes, no, from our lessons that we're learning from Ukraine, tanks are big things on the battlefield like that are easy to.
I have a suspicion that guy was blowing up the congressman's arse. If you look at the, it's only like a 15-page document, the Force 2030 document that the commandant put out, and it explains, there's lots of things we would like to do. Budgets are a thing. Manpower limitations are a thing. We have to focus on what's important to us as the Marines. And the Marines for the last 20 years, face it, they've been a second land army. They've been fighting in Iraq. Yeah. The U.S. And this is the same problem that the Marines had in 1930 as well. So after World War I, what are the devil dogs famous for? Bellow Wood. So there was 75,000 Marines in World War I, and only 2 brigades actually fought in Europe. But they're the ones getting all the attention. Hey, we're the Marines, we're the devil dogs, and the Army's going, that's our job. We sent a lot more men, and we fought on the same ground, doing the same thing. We can do that. You don't need the Marines to do that. And so in the 1920s and 30s, the Marines took a very long, hard look at themselves and said, how can we justify our existence? And they said amphibious assault, opposed amphibious landings, which was not a thing before the Marines got around to it under Commandant Lejeune. And so what Commandant Berger has done, he says, well, we don't need to be a second land army. We need to focus on what we do to help the Navy, because we are basically the Navy's army. And they said, let's focus on the Pacific, let's focus on littoral warfare, let's focus on anti-shipping and things like that. The Army can deal with the Army stuff. And in the paper, it states that heavy armored will remain the domain of the Army. It's not saying there is no use for heavy army. It just says, if you need a tank, call the Army. Which is fine. It's like, if you need an airplane, call the Air Force. Naval aviation will have their own issues with that statement. Well, you're all naval aviation. So I don't think the Commandant really cares very much what's happening in Ukraine. He would have liked to have kept the tanks if he had the money and the personnel to do it, but just on the whole priority of things and the fact that we operate as a joint force, and I mean, if the Army wants to land a tank company on a shore, on a beach, the Army has ships to do it. You can carry 15 tanks in one ship. Goes up to the beach, drops the ramp, out go your tanks. Now, they're not designed for opposed landings. I see no mechanical reason it can't be used for one, though, to help the Marines out. And the idea of Army tanks helping Marines, well, we did that in Fallujah. We had actually Army mortars as well, were used to help out the Marines. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with the Commandant's idea that if you need a tank, call the Army. The Commandant did not say we don't need tanks. Okay. Oh, there we are, hiding in the back. You're asking me to make an assessment on information that I've never looked up. I mean, the bottom line is, that would it really have made a difference? What do you say?
You saw the bomb happen.
Yeah. Well, that was happening anyway. Yeah, my understanding is that the Germans were not anywhere near close to getting an A-bomb. I mean, I think realistically what they would have done is they would have focused on improving their current equipment, their Focke-Wulfs, or maybe even the mesh, the 262s, things like that. But even then, when the 262 showed up, it wasn't as if the Allies didn't have something that could counter it if they wanted to. They had the Meteors. And it's one of the things that the Allies, again, if it wasn't absolutely reliable, they didn't think it was worth shipping over. So it wasn't as if the Allies didn't understand infrared equipment on tanks. They tried it on a Sherman in 1942. They tried inertial navigation on a Sherman in 1942. But they said, for combat purposes, this is useless. The Germans, hey, let's put this infrared stuff on our Panthers and Uhus, and we'll send it into battle. And everybody focuses on the fact the Germans were the first to field infrared fighting gear on tanks in battle. They were, and what did they do? They realized it didn't bloody work, and they took it off. And actually, they only used it on the Eastern Front because they already understood that the Western Allies understood infrared equipment and had detectors. You'll be shouting, "Hey, I'm over here!" if you're driving around with infrared on. So if the Germans had diverted from the Wunderwaffe to something more practical, I don't think it will make much difference because the Allies had equivalent technology anyway that they had to. They could field it. All right. I have a 3-hour drive home. Okay, go ahead.
So, with your experience researching, would you have any advice on somebody that wanted to do research like you do?
How much time and money have you? So here's how I do research. Let's say I go up to NARA, the National Archives up in DC. I take a week to go up there. This is, unless you live in the DC area, this is not something that you can just go in, in an evening and find what you're looking for. For two reasons. One, there's a lot of stuff there, and B, nobody knows where it is. You go up and say, okay, I want Ordnance Branch records, and I am looking for, let's say, the discussion that was going on about whether or not we need to be scared about the king tiger. And you know that it happened in 1943. You go to the National Archives and you go to the Finding Aid, and you will go to the section that says Ordnance Branch General Correspondence 1942-1944. That is a lot of correspondence. And there are hundreds of these boxes that almost nobody knows what's in them. So what I would do is I'd order, and fortunately you can order them by the truckload or the cartload. You're authorized to have 2 carts in storage that have already been pulled while you're working on the one cart out in the field or out in the main floor. And I'm just opening random boxes hoping to find something useful. Now, it's great in one respect. You can find things you didn't know existed to look for. But if you are looking for something specific, good bloody luck to you. I mean, if you do want to go that way, I have my records of what I opened up, and I can send you that, and that'll knock off about 5% of your problem. I mean, really, these are huge, and the staff are friendly, and it's a very easy system to use. But for the Army's records, they're awful. Now, the Navy's record is fantastic. I can go up to the microfilm because I've done it, and they have all the plans. We could rebuild. You know the way that they're rebuilding. Any train fans here? Oh, you know the way they're rebuilding a T1, Pennsylvania T1. It's like they built 40 of them. This is number 41. Or Tornado in the UK. It's like they built 40. This is number 41. We could take the plans in the National Archives, give them to an industrialist who has the capability of making it, and make a new New York class battleship. All the plans are there, and they're easy to find. I'm not going to say we should do it. Be interesting. Spare parts for Texas, that's undergoing dry dock right now. But unfortunately, the Ordnance Branch records are terrible. Now, there are regional archives. I've gone to the regional archives in Chicago, and the problem with them is that they're very poorly staffed and they don't know what they have either. The good news is they're not very big, so you can actually get through them. A lot of times things aren't where you look. So I go to Fort Lee, I look at the Fort Lee archives, and it's maybe about yay big. And it's a sort of pull-out shelves so you can access things. I mean, it's yay big, but it's absolutely jam-filled with stuff. And I could spend an extremely enjoyable full day going from one end of that archive to the other. I'll get it done in a day. I don't know if I get anything productive out of it from what I saw. Oh, that's a nice photograph. Next. So the only solution is really time. And I think that's why a lot of authors are retired, because they're the only people that have the time and money to actually go to the archives and do all this. So I have been very fortunate that Wargaming has paid for me to go and do my archive digging, and they pay for the trip, and they paid for my house, basically my rent, because they're paying me as a salaried employee. I hand over my materials to Wargaming, and I also use it for whatever else comes out.
Is that your job then?
My full-time employer is,
I'm trying to get too personal.
my full-time employer is World of Tanks, Wargaming USA. I've been changed from Director of Military Relations. I'm now a military specialist. But right now, Wargaming has gotten most of all the information it needs from the archive, so I don't do much archive digging anymore. It's more a case of I go to musea, I do films and things like that.
What is your military? So you're going to Fort Bliss. What unit are you with now?
I command it is the main command post operational detachment for 1st Armored Division. So again, budgets are a thing. About 10 years ago, the Secretary of the Army looked at how much a division headquarters cost, and he said, look, you guys are staffed for 24/7 operations in the combat zone. You don't need to be staffed for 24/7 operations in the combat zone when you're sitting in garrison in Fort Bliss or Fort Hood or whatever. So we are going to take a portion of your division staff and turn them into reservists. And so when the division deploys, us reservists go over. So there are about 40 of us National Guardsmen that wear the Armored Division triangle. There used to be a lot more when Texas had the 49th Armored Division. That went away many years ago, 2004 if I recall. And I command that detachment down in Fort Bliss. So I'm a company commander as a lieutenant colonel. I have a property book, I have a first sergeant. I'm there giving an Article 15 equivalent under the Texas Code of Military Justice to a private who ballsed up, and he's standing there in front of the lieutenant colonel because there's no captain with the authority to do it. It's me. Scared the living bejesus out of him. I don't think he's going to do it again. Yes, and in that case, I maxed it out because he was an idiot. Well, most every other soldier that has committed that offense has been separated, so I went easy on him.
Oh, okay.
All right, right. I think we're about done. So
Yeah,
I'm gonna drive home.